Hello and welcome back to the Endurance Limits podcast. Your hosts today are myself, Josh Sills, and I'm joined here with Darren Clawson. And today we're going to take you through all about how Endurance Limits started. And before we begin, this is quite a difficult story to tell. I'm sure by the end a lot of the audience are going to appreciate why this is a hard story to tell, but it is an important one. It's very pivotal and foundational to the Endurance Limits team, and it kind of goes to show and display the weight of why we do what we do, why it's important to do what we do, and just kind of set the tone for sometimes when we're in a real hole, when we're in a real mess and we're struggling to keep going, just kind of how we're able to dig a bit deeper and kind of what it means to us. So we've been asked to do this episode, and it is a bit of a hard story to tell, and there's a lot of emotions that sort of go into this story, and I'm sure that there are going to be many people listening that are going to resonate with this story and have similar stories that kind of they can reflect on and that they can compare and kind of see some similarities in their own experiences. And so with that all being said, I'm going to kick it straight over to Darren, and Darren's going to talk a little bit about Hadley and the inception of the Endurance Limits team.
Okay, mate. So, it all started with my son, Hadley, who was 18 months old at the time on Christmas Eve, and he was walking across the lounge to collect a toy from my wife. He collapsed into a massive seizure, and we basically immediately had a bit of a panic. We had to call 999. Ambulance crew turned up fairly quickly. We're quite fortunate in the area we live in. We've got an ambulance station literally just around the corner from us. And when the crew turned up, probably took about 3 or 4 minutes before they turned up, and he was still on the floor, seizing, not breathing. He'd obviously started to go blue by this point. When the ambulance crew first arrived, we got them in. Thankfully, they got to work straight away on him, but I kind of knew one of the guys from the ambulance, and he waited until my wife wasn't looking, and he just kind of looked across the top and shook his head and nodded towards the door. And it was really at that moment that I knew we had a major problem. So we managed to get him into the ambulance and get him up to our local hospital, where he stayed for the next 24 hours. And it seemed on the face of it like he just had a massive seizure, which can be caused by, temperature in kids in particular can cause massive seizures. They decided to keep him in for another 24 hours for observation, and while they were making that decision, he had another big seizure. So over the course of the next 5 days, they obviously medicated him in an attempt to make sure that he didn't have any more. But each day he had more seizures. So on the second day he ended up having 5 major seizures. On the third day he had 10. On the fourth day he had 20. And by the end of the week he was having about 50 seizures a day. Pretty traumatic, pretty exhausting to be a parent, to be watching your son gradually get more and more sick and have absolutely no idea what was going on. After about the 5th or 6th day, I spoke to the doctors and asked them the question, really, do you know what's going on? Do you know what's going wrong with him? And the doctor I think he was a little bit kind of offended by me asking the question in some ways, because I was kind of challenging him. And he said, well, kind of outside of Great Ormond Street, probably no one does. So I just looked across at him and said, well, what's he doing here then? If you're telling me that outside of Great Ormond Street no one really is going to be able to work out what's going on, like, surely we need to get these guys on the phone. So he then called Great Ormond Street. Great Ormond Street basically said, let's get him in an ambulance, get him up to us. It appears that it's something that we need to be dealing with. So within an hour of that phone call, I was stood at the front of our local hospital as he was loaded into the back of the ambulance. It's the strangest sensation.
I bet.
Mate, it's really genuinely the strangest sensation, because if your kid's going to Great Ormond Street, you know that you're in real trouble.
Hmm.
Only the most serious cases, the most complex cases, and the children that are at the biggest risk go to Great Ormond Street.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then the flip side of that is, the thing about Great Ormond Street is everyone knows the name, right? And everyone knows how amazing they are.
Mm.
So I had this kind of conflict going on where there was a part of me going, like, we're in serious trouble now. And then the other side of me going, but we're going to Great Ormond Street.
Mm.
So if there's anyone that's going to be able to help, it's those guys.
Mm.
So that conflict was quite difficult for me to process, really. I didn't know whether to hop up and down and like celebrate that he was going there, or to sit down and have a good cry.
Mm.
He got transported down to Great Ormond Street, and I followed down in my car. My wife obviously went in the back of the ambulance with him. When we arrived at Great Ormond Street, there was a team waiting at the front doors for him.
Mm.
They took him, a couple of doctors, a couple of nurses, porter. They took him straight in and started a barrage of tests.
Really?
Yeah, so they obviously, from their point of view, they needed to do the diagnostic tests and use their diagnostic tools to try and find out, okay, why is this happening?
Mm.
So he had ECGs, EEGs, lumbar punctures, MRIs, and like basically every test that you can imagine. Within 48 hours, he'd had all of those done. And he was up on Tiger Ward, which was a neurology ward at that point. Sadly, none of them really kind of explained what was wrong with him. And he continued to have seizures. Within a week of being at Great Ormond Street, he was having 100 seizures a day. So in the space of 2 weeks, I've gone from a perfectly healthy, perfectly normal, like normally developed 18-month-old son, to a son that's having 100 seizures a day that's in Great Ormond Street. Hugely traumatizing, to be honest with you. I'm trying to think of the right word, but trauma's probably the right word. Hugely traumatizing for me as his dad, because like, A, I don't know what's going on, and B, as a parent, you feel like it's my job to keep him safe. The next couple of months, Great Ormond Street just worked their socks off. They did everything you could possibly imagine to try and stabilise him. But unfortunately, he just got worse and worse and worse. And when you're having seizures and you're in a hospital, they do a thing called a seizure diary, where every time you have a seizure, they note the time, the day, the date. They note what type of seizure it was, how long it lasted, what the outcome was, how quickly they recover, etc., etc. And the situation with Hadley had got so bad over that couple of months that they had to reverse the idea of the seizure diary. So instead of noting a time that he had the seizure and taking those details down, they had to know any minute of the day that he didn't have a seizure.
Oh, man. And like, sort of, you've told me that a couple of times, but like, sort of, do you remember like going into Great Ormond Street for that day, or sort of like the kind of aha moment of kind of them communicating, we're going to have to sort of reverse this sort of seizure diary? Like, what did that feel like, and sort of, if you can take the audience back to sort of that moment?
Well, by that point, obviously, my wife left the house on the first day that the ambulance turned up and refused to leave his bedside. I was commuting backwards and forwards because I've got my daughter who's 18 months older than him, having to take her to nursery and stuff. So I was commuting backwards and forwards every day to Great Ormond Street with her. And I was seeing the amount of seizures he was having, and obviously liaising with the doctors and stuff. And when they told us that they were going to reverse the seizure diary, I was literally stood in the middle of the ward in Great Ormond Street. And I think it's just one of those moments where I'd already been watching it. I knew how bad everything was.
The kind of words validate it, though, don't they?
Mate, it makes it real, and it's just such a huge shock. I think that probably wasn't the kind of biggest, most impactful moment that we had. That probably came about 3 weeks later, and I can remember with crystal clarity that moment because it was my birthday, and I'd gone in to see him and walked in, picked up the kind of medical chart on the end of his bed, and there were only 3 entries for the last 24 hours. So that meant that for the last 24 hours, there'd only been 3 minutes when he wasn't having a seizure, which, like, you cannot sustain that. It's impossible. And it was that day that Dr. Cheryl Hemingway, who was one of the neurologists there, took me and my wife into a side room and sat us down, and, like, because of what I do for a living, as soon as we were asked, can you speak to the doctors? Yeah, of course, no problem, bring them in. No, like, we want you to come to this room. And as we're walking towards the room, I knew what was coming. And we opened the door, went in, there's a couple of chairs, there's a table, a box of tissues on the side. And I kind of, in my head, I was 2 steps ahead, but I already knew what she was going to say. And she sat down and basically said to us, we've done everything that we can over the course of the last 3 months, and his seizures have just got worse and worse and worse. We can't seem to put a lid on it, and no one can survive this level of seizures. And so essentially we were told that we should start thinking about preparing his funeral. Not quite in those words, because Great Ormond Street are a little bit better than that, and certainly a lot more articulate than me. But she made it clear that they expected that he would die before the end of the month. And that was on the 11th of March. And when she was talking, she said this phrase that just cut through me. She said, it's not one single thing that's going to kill him. He's just reached his endurance limits. And it's probably the worst sentence that anyone has ever said to me. And so, thankfully, over the course of the next couple of months, they tried some unlicensed drugs and some really kind of left field treatments and managed to stabilise him. And as is the way with Great Ormond Street, right? Even when you think you're doomed, there's always a chance as long as they're on the case. So they were able to stabilise him and save him. And 2.5, maybe a little bit more months later, we were walking out the front door with him. Now, he was still having a lot of seizures, and to this day, obviously, it's impacted his life in enormous ways. But they did what at the time looked impossible, right? Just keeping him alive looked impossible. And as we were walking out of the hospital, I spoke to one of the doctors, and as is my way, really, I kind of said, I'm going to do... What I actually said to him was, I'm going to raise you every single penny that it's cost you to look after my son, so that his care doesn't impact your ability to do this for other people's kids. Man, I had no idea. None. Not like the faintest idea about how much there was at the time, right? That's what I said. Kind of the most me thing ever. I was like, don't worry, I've got it. Yeah. I'm going to raise all this money. It's fine. And then I kind of, we managed to get him home. And probably a few days later, I sat down and said, okay, right, we need to find out what his number is now. And I phoned the hospital up and spoke to a few people.
Oh, you were serious?
Yeah, it pretty much was like that as well. I was like, we just, like, loads of people say that. Yeah. and I was like, no, like, as you know, mate, I'm quite big on, if I've given my word, then I've given my word. So, I need to make that happen. So I asked them, I said, well, what's a ballpark figure? Tell me, talk to me. And I think they were overly generous with me, right? Because they said, we can't really put a figure, it's really difficult. And eventually they said, like again, me, right? I'm like, yeah, I get that, but
Give me a number.
give me a number. Take a guess then, right? Like,
Yeah.
I don't know.
Work with me here.
Work with me. Give me something to work with. And they said, probably best guess, £250,000. So I was like, well, okay.
Say no more.
Saying that, like, £250,000 it is then.
Yeah.
Done.
Yeah. So shall it be written? So shall
Yeah.
it be done? We're getting it.
Now, you've got to bear in mind that obviously I've got a job. I work in the public sector. I don't earn a massive amount of money. I'm not kind of a high-flying businessman. And I earn about £7 a year. So £250,000 like a almost unachievable amount of money for me on the face of it. So I did what we do. I made a few phone calls, spoke to a few friends and said, let's go down a pub. We'll have a beer. We'll have a little team kind of chat. And Aaron came down and we had a conversation. And I said to him, like, mate, I'm like, this is done. It's not done yet, but this is done.
Yeah.
So I just need to find a way to do it now. And he was like, well, I'm not going to let you do this on your own.
Yeah.
So we decided that the only way to do it really was to do a big event and try and raise money. And the idea that we had was the bigger and more kind of stupid the event is, the more likely it is to get attention, the more likely people are to go, well, you're not sitting in a bar for beans, you're actually like doing something big, so we'll put our hand in our pockets and support you. That was the idea. So we Googled hardest foot race in the world, and the 260 kilometre jungle marathon pops up. Now, we're about 3 pints or 4 pints deep at this point, and it seemed like a great plan, bearing in mind neither of us had run round the block for however long.
Couldn't run a bath at that.
No, we couldn't run a bath. Excuse me. So we signed up for it there and then, and it asked us for our team name, and I still had this phrase kicking around in my head, this kind of phrase that had like cut right through me of, he's just reached his endurance limits. Your son's going to die because he's reached his endurance limits. And it was kind of like a poetic, I'm trying to think of the right way to articulate it, but like, he was supposed to be beaten and he'd survived it. And this phrase had so many terrible kind of connotations for me that I wanted to take it and use it for something good. So we decided that we'd call the team Endurance Limits. And that was how kind of the team name came about. That was how the first kind of steps along the path of all of the crazy endurance stuff that we've done since, and all of the money we've raised since. That was the inception of it all, was a doctor telling me my son wouldn't survive to the end of the month. And then me and my big mouth getting myself into trouble yet again. Making promises.
For the upteenth time.
Mate, making promises.
That week.
I've got the vaguest idea how I'm going to, like, I'm writing checks. There's no way I know how to cash at that point.
Absolutely. 100%.
But over the next like 12, 13 years, we cashed that check. So like, we promised we'd raise that money, and I mean, don't get me wrong, it was a lot of effort in it, and there was a lot of learning for us to do. I mean, we came home from the Jungle Marathon. Obviously, I won't go too much into the story of what happened on the first Jungle Marathon. We kind of touched upon it in Aaron's podcast.
Yeah.
But that's a hell of an event, man. That's more like a survival kind of race than an ultra.
I don't think it's going anymore, is it? Like,
no, it got cancelled because it was too dangerous. But we came home from that having raised about $4,000 or something. And I'm sitting staring at a £250,000
it like
target.
cost you 10 to do. Yeah.
I had like $6,000 on my credit card, and we'd raised like 5 or something. But what I will say is that was it was a really formative experience as well, in the respect that we learned so much. We learned so much about ultra endurance events and expeditions and fundraising and organisation and training and like just so much. There was so much that came from that event, as well as some of the most amazing friends that you could ever wish to meet. You know, people that will see this video and probably stick a like on it, and were people that were there with us and have followed the story and assisted and helped from that day to this. So yeah, it was a hell of an event, but ultimately it wasn't successful in terms of why we were there. So we went on from that to raise much larger chunks of money, much larger chunks of money, by doing some of this kind of stuff, engaging some corporate entities, getting some corporate sponsorship, and a variety of other bits and bobs. But it all started with that first seizure of Hadley.
Absolutely, and it's such a sort of like a moving story. I've heard it a lot of times, and it still finds a way to like cut through me, and like that, like it's what so much of us lean on and sort of like utilize in like our weakest moments. Like I know the amount of talks we've had, like when in the middle of the Pacific, like struggling, hands hurting, backs hurting, butts hurting, and cut up with with salt sores and things like that, and you're in so much of a hole, and just utilizing that story and like this appreciation for what these kids in Great Ormond Street are having to go through. It is not it's not a lick on what we're enduring voluntarily. I think is like such like a thing that I always go back to. Like I've signed up for this, like as a good cause and to help more children, but there are so many children in Great Ormond Street who haven't signed up to endure what they have to endure, and they're going through it, and the wonderful people of Great Ormond Street are doing their best to keep these children alive and just do the amazing job that they do. And I think that's such a wonderful thing about Great Ormond Street as well, is you talk to anyone you know, they've got a Great Ormond Street story.
They have, mate, and it's probably a good idea, probably a good time really to just talk about the fundraising that we're doing at the moment and where that money's going. So every single penny that we raise with this Amazon Mo project is going to be going to help build the Children's Cancer Centre at Great Ormond Street. Now, Great Ormond Street it's a centre of excellence, full stop, but it's hard to explain to people. It's more than that. It's basically the home of hope if you're in the shit. And the fact that that they have to raise money to build a children's cancer centre, like I'm mildly offended by already, to be honest with you.
Absolutely.
They need a massive amount of money. It's like £300 million that they need to build this children's cancer centre. And what we're going to do is going to be a tiny part of that, realistically, but it will make a difference. It will be a brick in the wall, a bed in a ward, you know, a nurse, a doctor, whatever. And the research that they're going to do there, the children's lives they're going to save there, they're going to change the world, right? Like, one way or another, that children's cancer centre is going to change the world. One of the kids they save could go on to be the Prime Minister, could go on to be the person that finds the cure for cancer, could go on to be whatever. And even if that ripple doesn't go out, then they're going to change the world for families. There's mums and dads that are going to have they're going to tuck their kids into bed because of what they've built. And so we need to raise that money. It's as simple as that. And it means that, like you say, right, when I'm on my arse 3,000 Ks into this row, I ain't going to be moaning about it. You know, I'm just going to be grateful to be fit enough and healthy enough to be on that river and not be stuck at 6 years old with no hair, suffering from cancer in a hospital. So yeah, that's why we're doing it. That's why we need the money. That's why we need people to donate, and that's why we need companies and corporations to either sponsor this row or go direct to Great Ormond Street. Right? Like, this isn't about us being able to wave a flag at the end and say, look how much money we raised. So much of the money we've raised over the last kind of 10, 12 years, we've said to people, just go direct. Just give the money direct to Great Ormond Street. We've got a Just Giving page if you want to go through that, so that, you know, we can kind of keep some sort of bead on the numbers and stuff, but we don't care, right? Have Great Ormond Street as your charity of the year. And if you're not sure how to do that, speak to us. We will put you in contact with the fundraising team there, the account managers there. Like, if you run a big company, we'll get you a tour of Great Ormond Street. We will take you to the hospital and show you the magic that they're doing. We just need you to give us a call, drop us an email. Let's save some kids.
Mate, it's can't be said any more eloquently than that, to be honest. So I don't think there's much point extending this podcast any further. We've told the story, and I'm sure loads of people will resonate and will be impacted by this story. So if you are, please do like it, share it, subscribe for more updates. Please do visit the Just Giving link that's in the show notes, that's in the description. Go and donate, even if it's not through us. Go to Great Ormond Street or get in contact in the comments, send us an email, whatever you need to do to save some kids, as Darren has so eloquently said. Let's make it happen. So there's our story. Thanks so much for tuning in, and we will be back very soon with another update in the Amazon Row. Take care. Peace.